Okay, so picture this. It is 1374. You are living in Basel, Switzerland. Beautiful city on the Rhine. Cobblestone streets. Church bells. Trade money moving through the place like blood through an artery. And then one day a chicken, yes, an actual chicken gets thrown at a rich man and the city nearly comes apart.
That is already one of the best openings to a historical story I have ever heard.
It sounds ridiculous, which is part of why it survives. But the chicken is not really the story. The chicken is the moment when everything beneath the surface becomes visible.
Right, because nobody riots over poultry.
Exactly. They riot over humiliation, over power, over a system that works beautifully for the people at the top and badly for everybody else.
So this is not a story about a bird.
No. It is a story about what happens when something small collides with something huge and already unstable.
Good. Excellent. Let us ruin everybody's morning.
Basel in 1374 was not some sleepy medieval village. This was a major European city, banking hub, trade centre, strategic position on the Rhine. If you wanted goods moving between Italy and Northern Europe, Basel mattered. Money flowed through this place constantly.
And where money flows, inequality usually follows close behind.
Always. At the top, you had the patricians, the old money families, the people with the trade networks, the banking interests, the inherited influence. They controlled the city council. They shaped policy. They lived in stone towers right in the city.
I am sorry, stone towers?
Stone towers. Tall ones. Some of them 80 or 90 feet high. Not because they needed a practical place to put sweaters. Not because every one of them was under immediate military threat. They were status symbols. They said, look how much wealth we can turn into visible, permanent stone.
So medieval penthouses.
Medieval penthouses with worse plumbing and more public resentment, yes. The point was the same. Conspicuous wealth is social instruction. Look up at me. Remember the gap between us.
Human beings really have only ever changed their toys.
Beneath them were the guilds, craftsmen, merchants, skilled workers, bakers, butchers, weavers, metal workers, traders. These were not the poorest people in town. They had organisation. They had some political presence. They could elect representatives, but they were constantly being outvoted and outmaneuvered by the patricians.
So the system had the appearance of participation without the reality of control.
Exactly, which is a very dangerous arrangement because it lets people taste representation while also teaching them that the result is fixed.
That is the kind of thing people can live with for a while and then suddenly cannot.
Right? And by 1374, that tension had been building for years. Food prices mattered, taxes mattered, merchant regulations mattered, but more than any single policy, there was a growing sense among guild members that the city belonged to the people who profited from it, not the people who kept it running.
Which is the real powder keg, not just hardship, the feeling that the game is rigged and that everyone knows it.
Yes. And then came the chicken.
All right, take me there. Marketplace, summer day. Where does the bird enter the story?
So there is a bustling market in Basel. Crowds, vendors, noise, food, bargaining, the whole machinery of urban medieval life. A guild member is walking through carrying a live chicken, probably taking it home, probably thinking about dinner, not revolution.
A normal day in which he is unknowingly transporting a future political symbol.
Exactly. He passes a group of patricians. Rich men in expensive clothes, probably looking like men who have never carried their own dinner home in their lives. One of them makes a remark.
And we do not know exactly what he says.
We do not. The sources do not preserve the line, which is unfortunate because I would love to know the exact sentence that helped nearly set a city on fire. But based on the reaction, it was almost certainly dismissive, a joke, an insult, some little aristocratic flick of contempt.
The kind of remark that means almost nothing to the person saying it and everything to the person hearing it.
Right? And this guild member, who has almost certainly lived inside that atmosphere of contempt for years, snaps. He does not argue. He does not bow. He does not swallow it. He throws the chicken.
Please tell me it connects.
Oh, it connects. Direct hit. Feathers explode. Bird panics. Market stops. One magnificent instant of total medieval disbelief.
That is sublime.
And the important thing is what happens next. Because if the patrician laughs it off, maybe this becomes a story told over ale for 10 years and nothing more. But he does not laugh. He erupts. He starts shouting about disrespect, about assault, about punishment, and then he orders the man arrested.
There it is. That is the hinge.
Exactly. Because in that instant, everybody in the marketplace understands what is being asserted. A rich man can insult a working man in public, and that is normal. But if the working man answers back in a way the whole market can see, the machinery of force appears immediately.
It stops being about one insult and becomes a demonstration of how the city actually works.
Within seconds, other guild members jump in. They are shouting at the patrician. More patricians appear. Someone calls for the city guards. Someone else throws a punch. And now the whole thing tips from insult to fight.
So now we have a full medieval street brawl.
Full medieval street brawl. Fists, sticks, market debris, whatever is close at hand. And the key fact is numbers. The patricians are outnumbered. This is a marketplace. There are far more guild members and townspeople than there are wealthy men with offended dignity.
Which means all that social superiority gets tested very quickly when you are physically surrounded.
Exactly. The patricians retreat, but they do not retreat to some neutral civic space. They retreat to their towers, these private stone monuments to wealth and status, and they barricade themselves inside.
So now, somehow, because of one chicken, we have moved from marketplace insult to urban siege.
Yes. In the middle of the city, guild members surround the towers. They are banging on doors, hurling rocks, shouting demands. But just as important as the immediate violence is the speed with which word spreads.
Imagine you are a baker on another street, or a metal worker in a shop, or a porter unloading goods by the river. Someone comes running in saying, "There has been a fight in the market. The patricians tried to have one of ours arrested over an insult. People are surrounding the towers."
And what you hear is not information. You hear recognition.
Exactly. Because this is not just about the incident itself. It is about every grievance looking for a point of entry. The taxes, the regulations, the corrupt favoritism. The humiliations that are too small to become headlines, but large enough to accumulate inside a person for years.
Everyone has his own version of the chicken moment. Everyone has his own instant of, yes, that. That is what I mean.
Right, so people start pouring in, and this is where the event becomes more than a mob scene. These are guild members. They are already organized people. They know how to coordinate. They have networks, leaders, routines, and habits of mutual obligation. Which is why history so often turns not on spontaneous anger alone, but on whether spontaneous anger can find existing structure.
Exactly. The bakers send runners. The metal workers bring tools that can also serve as weapons. The weavers and merchants help keep supplies moving. Food appears. Information moves. The crowd thickens and starts to behave less like random uproar and more like a civic bloc suddenly discovering its own power.
That is the moment when the ruling class should get very sober very quickly.
Yes, because a mob can burn itself out. A body of organised citizens with shared grievances and practical capacity that is much harder to dismiss. Night falls on the first day, and the city is in that eerie in-between state where violence and possibility coexist. Fires burn. People bring food. Stories start circulating. Not just about the marketplace, but about everything else. This official cheated us. That family manipulated prices. This court protected one man and crushed another. Grievances that were usually private become public all at once.
And that matters because when anger gets narrated collectively, it stops feeling like personal bad luck and starts feeling like a system.
Exactly. By the next morning, guild leaders convene, senior members of the trades meet and turn outrage into demands, more representation on the city council, tax relief, constraints on abuses, accountability from officials. The event is not shrinking. It is clarifying.
They move from eruption to politics very fast.
Which is one of the reasons this matters. The crowd is not simply intoxicated by destruction, it is beginning to formulate a program.
Which, to be fair, is usually the point at which people in power convince themselves that a hard crackdown will solve everything.
Yes, and that is what the Basel Council does. Instead of recognising that the city is confronting a legitimacy crisis, they respond as authorities across history so often do. With force, they send armed guards into the streets to break up the crowds.
And that is the kind of decision that looks strong for about 5 minutes and catastrophic for the next 50 years.
Exactly. Because once guards move in, the issue widens. It is no longer just about the original insult or even about guild demands. It becomes about whether ordinary people are allowed to assemble, protest, and pressure a government that does not listen to them.
The state turns one grievance into 10.
Right? The crowds fight back. Now there are actual street battles. guild members with clubs, hammers, axes, whatever they can get against guards with armor and weapons. People are injured. Property is damaged. Fear rises, but so does commitment.
Because once blood is in the story, backing down becomes psychologically much harder.
Yes. And then comes the development that tells you the council is in real trouble. Some of the city guards begin to switch sides.
Which makes perfect sense. They are not patricians. They are not tower people. They are closer to the crowd than to the men issuing the orders.
Exactly. They have families. They live in the same city. They are under the same economic pressures. And at a certain point, some of them decide they are not willing to club their neighbours back into submission for the sake of a social order that does not really include them.
That is when governments discover the difference between authority and legitimacy.
Yes. By day 3, Basel is on the edge of total fracture. Parts of the city are effectively under guild control. Patricians are trapped. The council cannot function normally. Trade is disrupted. The ruling elite finally grasps that this is no longer a momentary disturbance.
The chicken has become a constitutional crisis.
Beautifully put. And because the patricians cannot re-establish control quickly or cleanly, they do the thing ruling classes often do only when they have run out of better options. They negotiate.
Which is always amazing. Suddenly the impossible conversation becomes possible the instant the alternative looks worse.
Exactly. Representatives come out, talks begin, and for a brief moment, the city has to acknowledge that the people it had spent years managing are now actors it must actually bargain with.
The moment of truth has arrived.
The negotiations produce real changes. Over the next several weeks, a new charter is hammered out. The guilds gain substantially more representation on the city council. They get tax relief. There are new constraints on the worst abuses. This is not cosmetic. It is a genuine shift in power.
So the chicken worked.
The chicken worked for a while. But now we arrive at the part where you and I disagree.
Good. I was worried we were becoming too reasonable.
During the riot, there was property damage, windows smashed in patrician homes, merchandise destroyed, buildings burned, and I think that hurt the cause.
Oh, we are absolutely doing this now.
Yes. Because I think once you move from disruption into destruction, you hand your opponents a gift. They can stop talking about your grievances and start talking about your danger. They can say, see, this is not reform, this is chaos.
All right, but here is the problem. What do you do when you have spent years trying to work within the system and the system has no intention of listening? At some point, disruption is the only language power hears.
Disruption is not the same as destruction. You can strike, you can occupy, you can create pressure. You do not have to burn things down.
Can you always separate those as neatly as that? Because I am not sure history supports the tidy version. The patricians negotiated because they were afraid. If the guilds had simply staged a polite symbolic protest, I think the elite would have waited them out, arrested a few people, and gone back to lunch.
So you are saying political violence is justified when institutions refuse to respond?
I am saying that when peaceful channels are consistently blocked or neutralized, escalation follows. And yes, that can include property damage. We are not talking about wanting blood in the streets. We are talking about the destruction of property tied to a system people experience as oppressive.
Which is a very dangerous line to normalize. Because once you concede that logic, who decides what counts as legitimate property to destroy? Where does it stop?
The people living under the pressure decide when ordinary channels have failed. I am not saying it should be the first move. I am saying that history keeps showing us that power rarely yields because someone asks nicely for the 20th time.
But it also shows us that elites are very good at using disorder to justify repression. You break windows, they announce an emergency. They talk about restoring order, suspending liberties, protecting the public.
Which is exactly what the Basel Council tried to do, and it backfired because the guilds had enough support. That matters. Repression does not succeed automatically. Sometimes it exposes the authorities instead.
Fair. But then maybe the lesson is that what really forced change was not the damage itself. It was organisation, clarity of demands, and broad support. The property damage was a symptom of rage, not the strategic core.
Yes, that I can agree with. The chicken is the spark. The organisation is the fuel. The ability to sustain pressure is what turns an incident into reform.
All right, I can live with that formulation.
So did the reforms hold?
Not fully. That is the hard part. Because one of the cruel truths of political history is that winning a concession and securing a transformation are not the same thing.
Which is a sentence people should probably tattoo on their foreheads before they get involved in anything.
Exactly. Over time, the patricians adapt. They use wealth, influence, procedural delay, committee manipulation, legal loopholes, pressure, co-optation, all the familiar methods by which entrenched power regains ground without needing another dramatic showdown. They pressure guild representatives. They slow implementation. They reshape committees. They wait for public attention to drift. Within a decade, many of the gains made in 1374 have been eroded.
Which is infuriating, but not surprising. Power almost never stops fighting just because it has signed something.
Right? And that is the deeper lesson of Basel. The riot matters, the reforms matter, but they are not self-executing. If the organised energy that won them dissipates, the people who lost in the first round start rewriting the outcome in slower motion.
So the story is not a chicken caused a revolution and then everyone lived happily ever after.
No. The story is a chicken revealed a city to itself. It exposed the tensions, forced a confrontation, produced real gains, and then demonstrated how fragile gains can be if the people who win them stop defending them.
Which is both less romantic and more useful.
Usually the two travel together.
Yep.
All right, so what do we do with this story now? Because one reason it survives is that it is funny. A chicken, a rich man, feathers in the marketplace, but the reason it matters is that the human pattern underneath it is not funny at all.
No. It is painfully familiar. Resentment of insulated elites, a sense that the rules are tilted, the feeling that one more small humiliation might suddenly become the thing that no longer feels small.
Yes. History does not have to repeat mechanically for it to rhyme structurally. People can endure a great deal. But when disrespect, inequality, and political blockage reinforce one another long enough, apparently absurd triggers can become catalytic.
Which is why what looks trivial from above can feel momentous from below.
Exactly. And the Basel story also reminds us that outrage by itself is not enough. What changed the city was not just anger, it was anger finding organisation, existing networks, leaders, demands, a capacity to keep showing up after the first dramatic moment.
That is always the boring part people want to skip.
Yes, because the dramatic moment is cinematic and the institutional follow-through is paperwork, meetings, vigilance, and the willingness to be less glamorous than your own rhetoric.
Which is rude, honestly. History should reward vibes more often.
It almost never does. What it rewards, if reward is even the right word, is persistence.
So, if somebody listening is asking the obvious question, all right, then what is the practical takeaway? What do you say?
First, get organised before the moment arrives. The guilds mattered because they already existed. Outrage without structure burns hot and fast. Outrage with structure can negotiate, endure, and force change.
Second, know what you want.
Exactly. Demands matter. If your anger cannot become a program, somebody else will define the outcome for you.
Third, assume the fight continues after the headline moment.
Yes, because concessions are often the beginning of a second contest, not the end of the first one. If you stop paying attention, people with more money, time, and access start clawing back what they lost.
That may be the least romantic but most useful sentence in the episode.
And fourth, do not underestimate the political force of humiliation. People talk a lot about policy, and policy matters, but contempt matters too. The feeling of being talked down to, brushed aside, treated as ornamental in your own city that can accumulate into something explosive.
Which is why the chicken works as an image. It is funny, but it is also exact. It is a ridiculous object carrying a serious charge.
Precisely.
You know, I am still tempted to keep an emergency chicken with me at all times.
No, we are not doing that. I want to be extremely clear that we are not advising anyone to carry poultry into civic disputes.
A symbolic chicken then.
A metaphorical chicken.
A conceptual chicken.
Better, much better.
Fine. But I do think every society has a chicken. Some tiny thing that looks absurd right up until the moment it reveals the scale of the anger underneath.
That I agree with. So, here is the question. What is your chicken?
Not the joke. The moment.
The one small thing that makes the larger structure impossible to ignore?
Because that is when things move.
Or crack?
Depends what people do next.
Exactly.
The Basel chicken riot of 1374. a bird, an insult, a siege, a negotiation. A reminder that history often turns not because human beings are rational, but because they can only absorb so much before something ridiculous becomes decisive.
And if you learned something today, tell a friend. We will see you next time on the Mike and Mark History Experience,
where the past is never as dead or as stable as it first appears.
Whoops, I almost forgot. This is the part where I put on my lawyer Mike hat. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All historical claims are based on available historical records and scholarly interpretations of Basel, Switzerland in the medieval period. Any broader comparisons are presented as historical analysis and social commentary, not as literal equivalences or endorsements of unlawful action. Discussion of protest, unrest, and property damage is analytical in nature and does not constitute encouragement or instruction for illegal conduct. References to throwing chickens are satirical and should not be interpreted as literal advice. Listeners should consult primary sources and appropriate experts for deeper scholarly treatment of the topic.
Good night, Lawyer Mike.
Good night, Lawyer Mark.